October 7th, 1880, Bitterroot Valley, Montana Territory. Iona Margaret Llewellyn, 14 years old, set the second pine cross at the head of the second grave with the back of an iron sledgehammer. The first cross was already weather-grayed. Owen Llewellyn, her uncle, taken in August by the typhoid that had also taken his hired man and the half of his herd that drank from the same shallow well. The second was fresh cut. Maren Llewellyn, her aunt, had not survived him by 60 days. Iona had buried her 3 mornings ago in the south corner of the apple orchard, between the Roxbury Russet and the wild plum. The ground had not yet frozen, but it had hardened past comfortable digging. It had taken Iona 7 hours to open the hole. She had used Owen's spade and Owen's grub hoe and the thin steel pry bar from the smoke shed. She had not eaten that day until the cross stood true. Now the men from Stevensville were riding up the wagon road, 3 of them. Reverend Ezekiel Pratt, 51, in a black coat that had been cut for a heavier man and now hung on him like sail canvas in a windless harbor. His nephew Caleb, 17, lean and embarrassed and fond of the orphan girl in a way he was not yet permitted to name. And Hosea Whitcomb, 62, who owned the general store at Stevensville and held the paper on every second farm in the upper valley. Whitcomb rode a tall sorrel mare. The mare disliked Iona. Iona thought less of Whitcomb for it. They tied at the rail. Reverend Pratt removed his hat. He spoke first. "Miss Llewellyn, we are sorrowed." Iona inclined her head. She did not weep. She had wept on the night Owen was buried, and again on the night Maren had asked for water and not woken to drink it. She had spent the tears she meant to spend. "Reverend Pratt, Mr. Whitcomb, Caleb." Whitcomb did not remove his hat. He looked past her, at the cabin. 14 feet by 16, single pen, clay-chinked, sod roof, stone hearth. A cabin built green in the spring of 1879 by a Welshman who did not know that green logs shrink as they cure. The south wall had opened a hairline that summer. By the time Owen was buried, the hairline had widened in 3 places to the width of a man's thumb. By the time Maren followed Owen, the largest gap was 2 1/2 inches across, and the wind that came down off the Sapphire Range whistled through the south wall at a pitch that Maren had said reminded her of a drowning kettle. "Miss Llewellyn," Reverend Pratt said, "the county has a home in Missoula for girls in your circumstance. The matron is a kind woman. I have written to her. She will receive you within the week." "I am not going to Missoula, Reverend Pratt." "Child, there is no—" "I am not going to Missoula." Whitcomb stepped his horse forward 1 length. He spoke without dismounting. $40 cash, today, for the cabin and the 80 acres. As a kindness, miss, the cabin took 2 already. It will take a 3rd before the snow flies. I would not see your name added to those crosses, Miss Llewellyn. 40 cash. You may take it to Missoula, or to Hamilton, or to the steamboat at Fort Benton, and you may begin again. Iona looked at him a long moment. The wind moved the branches of the wild plum. A single late apple, missed at the harvest, hung yellowed on the russet. The mule, tied at the side of the cabin, snorted once. "Mr. Whitcomb, the Llewellyn place is not for sale." Mr. Whitcomb, the Llewellyn place is not for sale." Her voice was level, a girl's voice still, not yet a woman's, but level. "And you will not call my uncle's home a thing that took him. The well took him. I will close that well today. Reverend Pratt, I am obliged for your kind offer of the matron in Missoula. I am refusing it. Caleb, Tell your father at the Pratt parsonage that I am wintering here." She paused. The wind. "Gentlemen, good day." Whitcomb laughed. It was not a kind laugh. It was the laugh of a man who had been refused before and would be refused again, and had come to see the refusal as a small pleasure, a cup of bitter tea taken before riding home. He turned the sorrel. "6 weeks to the first heavy snow, Miss Llewellyn. Then we shall see." They rode out. Caleb looked back twice. Iona did not see him look back. She had already turned to face the south wall of the cabin, and she was counting gaps. She counted 12 before she stopped, because she knew there would be more, and the counting was for later, after the lamp was lit and the kettle was on. For now she walked the ground around the cabin foundation, and she touched the lowest course of logs at 23 places, and where her finger went into the second knuckle, she made a small chalk mark on the log above. She made 47 chalk marks before the sun went behind the sapphires and the shadow climbed the orchard wall. She did not sleep that night. She sat at Owen's pine table by the lamp, and she opened Owen's almanac, the one with the printer's mark of the Helena printing house, and she read the entry for tallow and moss seam fill that her uncle had circled in lead pencil during the spring of 1879. 3 lines. Owen had not used the method himself. He had built green and chinked with river clay, the cheap way, the fast way. The almanac said, ratio 1:3 by volume, rendered tallow to dry compressed sphagnum, applied warm but not hot, packed first with the mallet and froe. That was all. There was no diagram. There was no warning about the shrinking of green logs. There was no instruction for the sealing of a south wall gap of 2 1/2 inches. Iona read the 3 lines 4 times. Then she closed the almanac and she went to the smoke shed. The autumn beef was hanging there. Maren had slaughtered the bullock in the 2nd week of September, the last work of her last good month. Most of the meat was now smoked or salted. The trim fat, 6 pounds of it, still hung in a muslin bag from the 2nd peg. Iona took the bag down. She also took the rope from the 3rd peg, because she had a use for the rope. In the lean-to at the side of the cabin, the last ewe stood. Maren had named her Hilda. Hilda was 11 years old and had thrown twin lambs the previous spring and had fed those lambs on the last good grass of the Bitterroot Valley before the typhoid took the rest. The lambs were sold in August. Hilda was alone now and would not winter through. Iona had known this for a week. She did not flinch from it. She led Hilda out into the cold morning. She spoke to her as her father had taught her to speak to an animal that was about to give. She thanked the ewe by name. She did the work cleanly. She rendered 18 pounds of tallow that afternoon in Maren's iron pot, and she added the 6 pounds of beef trim, and the fat poured out of the muslin like slow honey, and she filtered it twice through a clean linen square, and she set the white tallow into 4 crocks to harden. 24 pounds of rendered tallow, enough by the almanac's 3-line arithmetic to seal 72 pounds of moss into the south wall and the west wall and the north wall and around the lintels of the door and the 2 small windows. The next morning, the bog. The Llewellyn place sat half a mile west of a sphagnum bog that the Salish had named long before any settler. In the spring, it ran with cold water from the snowmelt of the sapphires. In October, it had a 4-inch lid of early ice, and beneath the ice the moss grew thick and clean. Iona rode the mule across the half-mile track. She carried Owen's chopping axe and 3 burlap sacks. She broke the ice in 3 places along the bog's south rim. She wore Owen's leather coat over two of Maren's wool sweaters and Owen's canvas trousers cinched with a length of plow line. She lay down on the frost-stiff reeds at the rim beside the first hole and reached shoulder-deep into the water, and she pulled handfuls of sphagnum until each sack was full. The water shocked her arm to the bone within the first minute. She worked 5-minute bouts and rolled to the bank between bouts and held her arm against her belly under the wool to bring it back. The mule did not like the smell of the bog, so she tied the lead rope to a cairn of stones at the trailhead. By dusk, she had 140 pounds of wet moss heaped on the floor of the smoke shed, and she had built 4 rough drying racks of split pine over the small smoke fire, and the moss was beginning to dry. 3 days of low smoke, and the moss would be dry enough to compress. She rotated the racks every 6 hours through the dark of October 9th and the dawn of October 10th. She slept in a chair by the smoke fire so she would not miss a turn. On the morning of the 11th, she tested. She took a handful of dry moss and she compressed it in her fist, and she measured the volume against a tin cup. 3 cups of compressed dry moss to 1 cup of melted tallow by the almanac. She melted a 1/4 cup of tallow in a small pan over the cook stove. She packed 3/4 of a cup of moss into a slot she had cut between 2 scrap boards, and she poured the warm tallow over the moss with a wooden spoon. She let it set in the cold of the smoke shed overnight. In the morning, she struck the seal with the back of an axe head. The seal did not crack. The seal held. The boards held. She nodded once at the test rig. She set it aside. She went to the south wall. It took 12 days. She worked from sunrise to the lamp hour, and after the lamp hour she rendered more tallow if needed, and she packed the day's empty moss bag with the next day's compressed handfuls, and she slept 5 hours a night and rose before the rooster in the lean-to of Lanton's place, the nearest neighbor, which she could hear faintly across the meadow when the wind was right. The work had a rhythm. She mapped the cabin first. 47 gaps. She numbered each gap with chalk on the log above. The largest, gap 31, was the great south wall split, 2 1/2 inches across at its widest, and running 14 inches down between the 4th and 5th courses. The smallest, gap 44, was a hairline at the door lintel that she could feel only with the back of a wet finger held in front of it on a still morning. She worked from largest to smallest. She had reasoned that the largest gaps would consume the most material and the most daylight, and that if her tallow ran short, she would rather lose the smallest gaps than the greatest. For each gap, she did 4 passes. First, she packed the gap dry. She took a handful of dry compressed moss, and she pressed it into the gap with her thumb and forefinger, layering it like fish scales, the long fibers running horizontal so that the wind would have to turn through 90 degrees to enter. Second, she drove the moss home with a wooden mallet and a flat froe she had cut down from Owen's old shake splitter. She drove it until the moss sat 1/4 inch below the log surface on the inside and 1/4 inch below the log surface on the outside. She did this for both faces of the gap, inside and outside, working from the cabin's interior in the morning and from the cabin's exterior in the afternoon when the sun warmed the south wall. Third, she warmed the tallow in the iron pot on the cook stove until it ran like slow honey. Not hot. Hot tallow shrinks too much when it sets. Warm tallow penetrates the moss and hardens slow and tight. She poured the tallow into a small wooden cup, and she carried the cup to the gap, and she ladled the warm tallow with a wooden spoon over the packed moss, watching it sink and saturate, refilling the spoon, watching it sink and saturate, until the moss was dark and full, and the gap stood proud of the log line by 1/8 of an inch. Fourth, she did a smoothing pass with the back of a flat carpenter's chisel, scraping the proud tallow flush with the log, leaving a clean bead. She did this on both faces of every gap. 12 days. Gap 31 took her 2 whole days. She worked it from inside in the morning of October 14th and from outside in the afternoon of October 15th. She used 3 pounds of moss and 1 pound and 3/4 of tallow for that single gap. The 2.5-inch slot was the test of the method. She packed it in 3 layers, not 1. The deepest layer ran the long fibers vertical, not horizontal, so the wind could not lift the strand. The middle layer crossed at right angles, like the grain on a barrel stave. The surface layer ran horizontal again, so the tallow would lay clean. She poured the warm tallow in 3 pourings, 20 minutes between each pouring, so the upper layer would not pull the lower layer up out of the slot as it cooled. When she finished it, she set her hand against the inside face, and the wood was warmer than the air, by a degree she could feel with the heel of her palm. She did not weep. She drank a cup of dandelion coffee, and she went to Gap 30. She kept a small penciled tally on the inside face of the door frame. Each gap finished, a chalk hash. Each pound of tallow used, a chalk dot. Each handful of moss, a chalk slash. By the end of the 7th day, she had 34 hashes, and the south wall was complete. By the end of the 9th day, the west wall was complete, and Gap 41 was the longest of the remaining work. Gap 41 ran the entire upper plate of the north wall, where the rafter had pulled away from the top log by 1 inch and 1/8. She had to stand on Owen's wooden ladder for that work, and the cold air at the ceiling made her hands clumsy, and she dropped the wooden trowel twice into the lap of her apron, and she swore quietly in the Welsh of her father, the only Welsh she remembered, and she finished the gap before sundown of the 11th day. By October 26th, every gap was sealed. She had used 19 pounds of tallow and 73 pounds of compressed dry moss. She had 4 pounds of tallow remaining and a small store of moss for repairs. She cached the remainder in tin cans in the root cellar beneath the potato crib, beside the 4 crocks of the autumn cherries that Maren had put up in syrup 3 weeks before she fell. On the evening of the 26th, Iona sat at the table by the lamp. She had not stopped to think for 12 days. She thought now. She thought of her father, the cooper at Sioux City, who had drowned in the breakup of the Missouri ice in the spring of 1879. She thought of her mother, who had lived long enough after to send Iona west to Maren and Owen with a Welsh prayer book and a small enamel locket and $28 sewn into the hem of a black dress. She thought of Maren, calling her child in a voice no louder than a cat's purr. She thought of Owen, telling her on the porch one June dusk that the Bitterroot Valley was the second best place God had made, and that the first best was wherever a Llewellyn was at table with another Llewellyn. She thought of the cabin. She got up. She walked the inside of the south wall, hand to log, log to hand. The wall was tight. The wind was up outside, and the south wall did not whistle. It did not hum. It did not breathe. It was a wall. Snow began on the night of October 28th. By morning, 14 inches. Inside the cabin, the cook stove ran on a fistful of pine, and the air at the table was 62 degrees by Owen's mercury thermometer. The chimney drew straight. The door did not whistle. Iona slept 11 hours that night. It was the first true sleep she had taken since the burying of her aunt. November passed. December passed. The long winter was upon the northern plains, and the Bitterroot Valley shared the punishment with Dakota and Nebraska and the Powder River Basin. Snow accumulated to 4 feet, then 5, then 6. Stevensville hauled hay at first, and then ran out of hay and bought at $1 a hundredweight from the Pratt family barn, and then the Pratt family barn ran out, and the cattle began to fall on the open range. Hosea Whitcomb's store ran short of flour by Christmas and short of sugar by the second week of January. The Reverend Pratt preached on the prophet Job, and the Whitcomb pew was empty on the first Sunday of February, because Whitcomb had walked himself to a paying funeral in Hamilton that morning, and the road was very bad. On February 9th, the storm. The Stevensville men later called it the Great Hunger Storm. The barometer fell 66/100ths of an inch in 9 hours on the 8th, and the wind out of the north came on at sundown that day. And by midnight on the 9th, the temperature had fallen to 32 below zero, with a steady wind of 45 miles by Owen's old anemometer, and by dawn of the 10th, the temperature read 42 below, and the wind hit gusts of 65. It would hold those numbers, with small variation, for 8 days. The Pratt parsonage opened on the south wall on the morning of the 3rd day. 11 feet of split between the 5th and 6th courses, run from the lintel of the parlor window to the floor. The Reverend Pratt's mercury thermometer, the one Iona had so admired the previous summer in his study, read 4 below in the parlor at the moment of the split. Within 90 seconds of the split, it read 22 below. Esther Pratt, the Reverend's wife, was bedridden with a January cough and was sleeping in the parlor that morning because the bedroom flue had cracked and would not draw, and the room had become too cold for her lungs. Caleb Pratt and his cousin Tom carried Esther wrapped in 3 quilts the 1 4/10 miles to Whitcomb's store. They walked into the wind. Esther's left cheek had taken the frost by the time they reached the store. Hosea Whitcomb opened the door and looked at her and at the boys and said, "There is no room. The roof is gone." The store roof had collapsed at noon of the 2nd day under the weight of accumulated snow and ice. Hosea Whitcomb and his wife Salome and their 3 remaining at-home children, 8 and 10 and 12, had been living since then in the church basement. The church basement had a Franklin stove, but the flue ran up into the side of the chimney mass at an angle that did not draw in a north wind, and the basement was now 38 degrees and falling and full of black coal smoke. The Pratts and the 2 Whitcomb cousins joined the 8 already in that basement, making 13 souls in a 16 by 20 room, and there was no longer a house in Stevensville with a flue that drew clean and a wall that held its heat. On the 5th day, 2 of the Whitcomb children, the 10-year-old Hannah and the 8-year-old Jonas, fell into the slow drowse of the cold. Salome Whitcomb opened her dress and held the 8-year-old to her own bare ribs under 3 blankets, and the boy came back to her in an hour. The 10-year-old took longer. By the 6th day, she was speaking again, but her speech was slow, and her eyes did not focus on her mother's face when her mother spoke her name. 2 3/10 miles to the east of the church basement, Iona Llewellyn was banking the cook stove for the night of February 14th. She had not seen the chimney smoke of Stevensville for 4 days, because the storm hid the town from her south window in a moving wall of white. She did not yet know that the parsonage had cracked open, or that the Whitcomb store roof had fallen. She knew only that her cabin was warm and that her chimney drew straight, and that the south wall did not whistle. She kept a small piece of pine kindling, the length of her hand, by the cook stove door, and she lit a fresh pine taper from the lamp every evening after her supper. And she walked the inside of the south wall with the taper held an inch from each gap, and the flame did not flicker at any of the 47 gaps. And she put the taper out, and she went to bed in the cot by the iron stove. And she slept. On the 6th day, Reverend Pratt sat on the cold concrete floor of the church basement with his wife's frostbitten cheek under his hand, and he said aloud, in a voice he had thought he would not use again, "She'll be buried by now, up the Orchard Road. She'll be—" Esther Pratt, who had not spoken in 12 hours, opened her eyes. "Ezekiel," she said, "the chimney smoke." Pratt looked at her. "I saw it on the 2nd day," Esther said. "The Llewellyn chimney, drawing straight. I saw it on the sleigh from town. Send Caleb. Send him now." Caleb Pratt, who had been sitting against the basement wall with his arms around his knees, stood up. He did not wait for instruction. He took the second of the 2 long ropes from the basement closet. He took the surveyor's compass that had hung by the parsonage door these 11 years. He bound a strip of his uncle's coat over his face from the brow to the chin, and he cut 2 eye holes in the strip with his pocket knife, and he tied the rope around his waist, and he opened the basement door and walked into the storm. It was 2 3/10 miles to the Orchard Road. Caleb Pratt had measured it, with the surveyor's chain, in the August of 1878, when his uncle had paid him $1 for the labor. He walked it now in the whiteout, and the wind, and the 42 below, and the rope paid out behind him, and he came at last to the edge of the orchard, and he stood in the lee of the wild plum, and he saw the chimney of the Llewellyn cabin, and the chimney was drawing clean, and there was a candle burning in the south window. He stood and looked. Then he turned and walked back along the rope. He came into the basement at the very end of the rope. Half his face was gone to the frost. He could not yet feel the cheek, and he would lose the cheek in the end, but he was a long way from knowing that. He breathed twice into the warmer air of the basement. He looked at the 11 faces. He said, "She is alive. The cabin is warm. She will take us." They made the walk on the morning of the 7th day, 11 of them, Ezekiel and Esther Pratt, Hosea and Salome Whitcomb, and their 3 at-home children, Tom Pratt, Mrs. Lanton, the widow from the next farm, who had been in the basement since the 4th day, the surveyor Hoyt, who had been caught in town when the storm came on, and Caleb Pratt at the head of the line, because he had walked the rope already and could walk the rope again. They held the rope between hand and hand. Caleb led. Hosea Whitcomb walked at the very rear because he was the strongest, and he could lift Mrs. Lanton if Mrs. Lanton fell. Mrs. Lanton did not fall. They walked 2 3/10 miles in 3 hours. At the orchard wall, Caleb stopped and pointed. Iona had seen them coming. She had been at the south window because the south window faced the road from town, and she had looked up from her mending as soon as the candle flame moved in the draft of the door catch, and she had seen the line of small dark figures against the white of the snow, and she had gone first to the cook stove and laid in 2 long pine quarters and the elk shoulder she had saved, and the kettle, and the iron pot of barley that had been simmering for 3 days against this very thing. She opened the door before Caleb knocked. Esther Pratt was the first one in. Esther's left cheek was the color of a day-old plum. Her right cheek was raw where Caleb had rubbed it with a glove on the orchard wall. Iona caught Esther under the arm. Iona was not strong enough to carry Esther, but she was strong enough to walk her the 8 steps to the bench by the cook stove. She said, "Pull a chair to the stove, Mrs. Pratt. There is broth." Salome Whitcomb came in with the 8-year-old Jonas in her arms and the 12-year-old Mary at her hip. The 10-year-old Hannah walked in on her own legs, but she walked slow. Iona took Hannah by the hand and put her on the second bench, the one Owen had made, the one closest to the iron pot of barley. She gave Hannah a tin cup of broth. Hannah drank the broth. Hannah's eyes came back into focus before the cup was empty. The Reverend came in then. He stood 3 steps inside the door. He did not speak. He looked at the south wall, the great gap 31, sealed clean and tight, the bead of tallow still bright in the lamplight. He looked at the cook stove. He looked at the orphaned girl who had not gone to Missoula. He took off his hat. He said, in a voice that did not steady, "Miss Llewellyn." She said, "Sit down, Reverend Pratt. There is a chair by the stove." The last man across the threshold was Hosea Whitcomb. He stood in the doorway with the storm behind him and the warm cabin in front of him. He did not step in. He looked at her. He was 62 years old, and he had told her in October that her cabin would take her before the snow. He opened his mouth. Iona said, "Mr. Whitcomb." He closed his mouth. She said, "Sit down, Mr. Whitcomb." He sat down. She closed the door. The cabin held at 48 degrees by Owen's mercury thermometer for 3 days. She fed 11 mouths on the elk shoulder and the barley and the autumn cherries Maren had put up in syrup. On the morning of the 10th day, the storm broke. The 11 walked back along Caleb's rope to Stevensville. Hosea Whitcomb was the last to leave. He left a folded note pinned under a tin cup on the table. The note was in his own hand. The note said, "I owe you the store. I owe you my children. Forgiveness is yours to give." Iona read the note. She did not weep. She folded the note and she put the note inside the family Bible at the book of Ruth, between 2 pressed apple leaves. She put the Bible on the shelf above the cook stove. She lived in that cabin for 43 more winters. She married a teacher out of Hamilton in the autumn of 1888, a quiet man named Aaron Klein. She buried Aaron in the orchard in 1923, and she buried herself in a coffin she had made of pine the previous summer, beside Owen and Maren, and Aaron in the spring of 1924. The cabin still stands. The tallow and moss seal on the south wall still holds. By the time she was old, the Bitterroot Valley called her, in the Welsh of her father, More Llewellyn, Mother Llewellyn, and the children of the valley brought her late apples each October until the autumn she could no longer come to the door. The cabin remembers her. The orchard remembers her. The seal she set in the south wall of the cabin no one would winter in held through the 8 days of the great hunger storm, and through every one of 43 winters after. Her seal held that winter. The seal still holds.